Good morning. It's Monday, April 21st. The multi-front war in the Middle East is now 563 days old. I'm your host, Jonathan Schanzer. Welcome back to the FDD Morning Brief. We're all waking up to the news of the passing of Pope Francis, a sad day in the Catholic world. In the Middle East, though, everyone is talking about those Iran talks. It's on the verge of panic over there in Israel. There was a meeting a few days ago between Stephen Witkoff, the president's envoy to just about every conflict on the planet, and some senior Israeli officials who are concerned increasingly that the presidential envoy may be on the verge of making a big mistake with Iran. Ron Dermer, Israel's strategic affairs minister, and David Barnea, the head of the Mossad, Israel's CIA equivalent, met with Witkoff. They tried to warn him that whatever deal is made with Iran must demand one thing: no uranium enrichment, none whatsoever. That's what would prevent Iran from getting a nuke somewhere down the line. Witkoff, however, apparently didn't bite. And then he went headlong into those talks with the Iranians, who were just thrilled to work with him. Sure enough, it looks like we could be in for a repeat performance of the 2015 nuclear deal. That was not pleasant back then. I can't imagine it will be any more fun now. The good news, though, is that there is still some time for Witkoff to back away from this. The bad news is that it's not clear that he will. Our guest today is Juan Zarate. Juan was Deputy Assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor for Combating Terrorism under George W. Bush. He also co-founded FDD's Center on Economic and Financial Power, and he's a panelist on today's FDD event. It's titled The Trajectory of the U.S. Economic Statecraft, which will be live streamed at 12 p.m. Eastern. I sought out Juan for this episode because I can't think of anyone better to unpack the Trump administration's financial policies, from tariffs to sanctions and more. So stay tuned for our conversation in just a few short minutes. Naim Qassem, the new Secretary General of Hezbollah, just declared that his group will not disarm. I'm not sure he's buying what he's selling. I'm not sure I am either. First, let's just acknowledge this guy is nothing like his predecessor. Hassan Nasrallah was charismatic. Naim Qassem is not. Hassan Nasrallah could whip a crowd into a frenzy. Naim Qassem puts crowds to sleep. Right now, Naim Qassem is desperate. The Lebanese people have awoken from a long slumber. They were sleepwalking through the last 40 years as Hezbollah slowly destroyed their country. Today, the Lebanese people are finally speaking out. In the aftermath of Israel's beeper and walkie-talkie operations, the Israelis went on an offensive and destroyed a massive amount of Hezbollah's weaponry. Today, it's hard to say what the group has left, and the Lebanese government, weak as it is, now seeks to seize the offensive. Lebanon has a secret weapon right now. It's not the Lebanese armed forces. No, I'm watching Morgan Ortagus. She is Stephen Witkoff's deputy, and she owes the Lebanon file. Whatever she's doing right now is actually working. Israel and Lebanon are quietly cooperating to weaken Hezbollah. It's a mutual interest thing. Who had that on their bingo card? Things are definitely better, but this job is not over. I can't tell how close or far we might be from that ultimate objective. But every time Naim Qassem says his group won't disarm, I get the sense that he's losing his grip. And that, my friends, is a very good thing. Now for your headlines. Headline 1, Turkish intelligence chief Ibrahim Kalin met with Hamas leaders over the weekend. Turkish state media reported the meeting, but didn't say where it took place. Other media reports said the Hamas delegation traveled to Turkey. The delegation was led by Mohammed Darwish, who's head of Hamas's political council. They reportedly spoke about ways to get more humanitarian aid into Gaza. In case you missed it, Hamas is nearly bankrupt and struggling to pay its fighters. The group is notorious for skimming aid to stuff its own coffers. So, yeah, no surprise that Hamas wants aid to flow into Gaza, and no surprise that the Turks are more than happy to help out, being the loyal Hamas sponsors that they are. Kalin reassured Hamas of Ankara's steadfast support. Turkey is once again showing us that they're the worst ally in NATO. Headline 2, the U.S. and Iran held that second round of nuclear talks in Rome. They lasted 4 whole hours. U.S. envoy Stephen Witkoff led the American delegation, and Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi headed up the Iranian team. Oman served as the mediator and hosted the talks at the Omani ambassador's residence in Rome. U.S. officials said good progress was made. Araghchi told Iranian state television things are moving forward, and the Omani Foreign Ministry issued a statement announcing that a third round of talks is expected to commence in the next few days back in Muscat, Oman, which just happens to be the place where the Houthis have their headquarters. Just so we're all on the same page here, there's lots of nervous people in Jerusalem as well as Washington and beyond. The Omanis suggested that American negotiators might be okay with Tehran maintaining its ability to develop civilian nuclear energy. If true, that rules out the full and verifiable disarmament of Iran's nuclear program. We could be headed for another bad nuclear deal, folks. Buckle up. And headline 3, Hamas launched a deadly attack against Israeli troops in northern Gaza. The attack killed 1 soldier. He's the first IDF soldier killed since Israel resumed fighting in Gaza last month. According to initial IDF probes, a group of soldiers was driving along an IDF logistics road when Hamas operatives emerged from a tunnel shaft and fired an RPG at the soldiers' unarmored vehicle. 3 women from a combat intelligence collection were wounded, 2 of them seriously. About a half hour later, Hamas terrorists set off an explosive device near Israeli rescue forces who had arrived at the scene of the RPG attack. That explosion claimed the life of an Israeli soldier and wounded 2 others. That brought the toll for Hamas's back-to-back ambushes to 1 killed and 5 wounded. It's a reminder that even as the group loses strength, Hamas retains some lethal capabilities. Wars are never clean or neat, and this war is no different. This war continues to drag on. All right, it's time for my conversation with my good friend and colleague, Juan Zarate. When we talk about U.S. sanctions, I think it's important that people understand that Juan literally created the system we have right now in place in the U.S. government. It was truly some groundbreaking stuff back then. I think it's still amazing today. When I worked at the Treasury Department many moons ago, I was in awe of this man. And to be honest, I still occasionally fangirl over him. Can't help it. When it comes to the intersection of economics and national security, Juan knows his stuff. Welcome to the program, Juan Zarate.
Jonathan, thank you. I'm honored to be with you. I'm a huge fan of yours, as you know, so thank you.
Yeah, but I fangirl over you. You might be a fan of me, but I fangirl over you. So
you're a good man, Jonathan. You're a good man.
All right, well, let's start from the beginning here. Tell us about the creation of Treasury's Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, TFI. What was the goal? What did we accomplish? And what do we have now?
In essence, Jonathan, in the post 9/11 period, the government, President Bush, asked the Treasury Department to use all of its powers, all of its authority, all of its information to undermine the ability of terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda to raise and move money around the world. And so what eventually emerged from that was the creation of the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, which had its mandate, really the national security dimensions of what the Treasury could do to find the vulnerabilities of our enemies, how they were trying to raise and move money, what those networks look like, and then how we could use Treasury's unique authorities and relationships around the world to unplug those actors from the financial and commercial system. At the end of the day, Jonathan, TFI, as we call it, was created to make it harder, costlier, and riskier for America's enemies to raise and move money around the world and to undermine their strategic interests. And that went beyond Al-Qaeda, went to all terrorist groups around the world, to terrorist supporting states like Iran, and certainly to rogue states like North Korea and others, and certainly now with Russia and China as chief adversaries and enemies in many respects to the United States. That's what TFI was built to do, with an intelligence function that you were part of and helped to build. That really was the first in the world for any finance ministry to have an intelligence function. So it has become the war room in thinking about how to use Treasury's tools. And it's become more important as economic security has taken pride of place in our national security.
Absolutely. And it has expanded has in it. I mean, we're looking now at the ability to target narco terrorists, human rights violators, proliferators of weapons of mass destruction. So tell us about this widened architecture that we have in place. That went beyond, I think, what you initially envisioned. Yeah.
Well, yes and no. I think we had in mind, Jonathan, when we were working together, the application of sanctions, anti-money laundering rules, all of the tools that the Treasury could bring to bear against all the rogue actors that were, in essence, trying to access the financial system. We had made a strategic decision that we were going to use tools aggressively and preventatively to disallow access to the financial system. And so that meant, again, not just terrorism, but we started to look at proliferation and proliferation finance. We started to look at human rights violators. Even at the end of our tenure with President Bush, we were looking at the application broadly to corruption and corrupt regimes like the Syrian regime, for example. And so there was very much in mind the use of the same playbook that we had used with terrorist groups against all the rogue activities and actors that presented a threat to U.S. national security. And so the expansion that you described is a natural expansion of what we built, which is let's look at those transnational threats and those transnational networks, be they state or non-state actors that present those risks. Let's find ways to highlight and isolate them. And let's use the predominance of the U.S. financial and commercial system as a tool of national security to isolate those actors. And that's really what has become of that Treasury office and certainly that strategy.
Yeah, it's an impressive architecture, and I continue to see new uses for it. But then there's this, Juan. There are some who say that we have over-sanctioned everyone to the point that sanctions don't work anymore, that it's weakening the dollar, that it's weakening the structure of the that architecture that you created, that it's somehow eroding the foundations of it. What do you say to those critics of the system that you and I helped create?
Well, I agree and disagree. Jonathan, you may remember I wrote long ago about the potential tipping point where we overuse sanctions, where we overburden the private sector, where we make American capital and even the dollar unattractive or less attractive, and that we needed to be wary of that moment. But I would retort in two ways. One, to the extent that sanctions are applied strategically and well, and with clarity as to what the norms are that we are enforcing, the sanctions actually reinforce the place of the United States as a leading financial system. The international financial order, if you will, depends on transparency, accountability, traceability. These are the norms of the system. And to the extent that the United States is using sanctions to expose nefarious activity, illicit activity, things that challenge that system. For example, the Iranian use of the Revolutionary Guard to control 40 to 50% of the economy, if not more, and to hide their hand in so doing, that's actually incredibly valuable and important. And even if there's griping from various capitals around the world or banking centers, at the end of the day, those are important sanctions and important measures. When we start to use sanctions for social or ethical or other issues that aren't so clearly tied to the transparency of the financial system, I think we start to then run the risk of the overuse and then the rejection of sanctions. Because at the end of the day, the sanctions, as you know, Jonathan, are only as effective as they are implemented. And they have to be implemented not just in capitals around the world, but in boardrooms and in compliance offices and in general counsel's dictum within companies in the private sector. And to the extent that they're seen as legitimate and important, they will be applied. The biggest challenge, I think, Jonathan, to the U.S. role in the international financial system is the sense of instability of the U.S. Political system and financial system. To the extent that traders, investors, companies can't rely on the United States, don't see U.S. bonds as the safe harbor investment around the world, don't see U.S. capital markets as the open, most attractive, most free, then that, I think, is the real challenge to dollar primacy, the primacy of the U.S. and the ability of the U.S. to remain dominant in the economic and financial domain.
Yeah, and I think that leads me to this question, and I think we have to talk about it. Let's get into these tariffs. What is happening here, and will this ultimately undermine that financial strength, that pillar that you're talking about here, that makes our sanctions effective, that makes our economic statecraft effective? What's happening here? Is this strategically wise? Is it a mixed bag? How do you view what the Trump administration has launched here in terms of this trade war?
Well, I think it's problematic, Jonathan, in part because it's been implemented in a way that is unclear and creates uncertainty in the market with respect to the U.S. position. I think the fact that the bond markets went wobbly at the start of the tariff policy, when the administration announced the high levels of tariffs based on a kind of an odd calculation as to what the tariff levels would be. The fact that the bond markets went wobbly, I think, was the last straw for those in the administration and certainly for the president that were worried about the effects of that policy on the bond market and the faith and confidence in the U.S. financial system. And so I think that was a canary in the coal mine as to how far we can go in terms of using our economic and commercial might and tariffs to try to change the global trading order and commercial system in one fell swoop. Now, you can have an honest and a good debate about whether or not the international commercial system needs to be reordered, whether or not the U.S. has ceded too much manufacturing capability, especially for exquisite technologies, semiconductors. Those are important debates and certainly things that I think we would agree with. But the way this is implemented or has been implemented with kind of a shock and awe approach to all countries, high-level tariffs, was really a shock to the system. And I think the fact that the administration backed away, has now entered into negotiations, it says now with 90 countries around the world, has tried to refocus through Secretary of the Treasury Bessent on isolation of China as a theme, as opposed to punishing everybody in the world with tariffs. That seems to me to be a rebalancing of how we're going to think about tariffs as a tool of economic statecraft, as opposed to just a blanket dogmatic use of tariffs to try to rewrite the order of the 21st century commercial system.
So let's talk about China, because I think that really always was the focus, and it should have been the focus. We've absolutely ceded a huge amount of manufacturing to the Chinese. There's just so much that we depend on right now. I always talk about how there's not even a filter on Amazon. If I want to buy something that's not made in China, I don't even know how to find that on Amazon, let alone you start going to places like Temu where you know that it's entirely CCP made. But so, I guess I understand how tariffs can hurt the United States. I think it's pretty clear how it already has. But what about the way that they might impact China? Their economy right now is teetering on disaster. So can they withstand what Trump has started to implement? And I guess maybe the bigger question is it worth it? Is it worth it for us if we start causing pain to the Chinese government and force them to reconsider some of their trade policies? Are we winning by doing that?
Well, of course, the Trump administration, as they backed away from tariffs to most of the world, actually increased tariffs to 145% on China. They have since obviously allowed for certain exemptions like electronics, which puts a big hole, obviously, in that tariff application for China. But you're right, Jonathan. China's economy has been struggling. We know about the real estate bubble. We know about the challenges of investment, the asset flight. Foreign direct investment has been more cautious with respect to China. Some of this is of China's own doing. Some of this has to do with their COVID policies. Some of it has to do with many countries around the world determining, especially in the wake of COVID, that there are too many dependencies, critical dependencies on China, and that can't be sustained. So I think all of this, to your point earlier, has to be a focus on China. I think the best strategic view of this is the tariffs are coming at a time of Chinese economic weakness and will further weaken their ability to project power, to withstand the economic choppiness of their environment, and won't allow them to be quite as aggressive as we once thought. On the other hand, and a pessimistic view is this is accelerating a direct conflict with China, one that we anticipated, for example, if China invaded Taiwan, but now we are starting to see direct economic confrontation with China. And just this morning, Jonathan, reports are that China is now threatening countries that are seeking a deal with the United States on the tariffs if those tariffs or if that deal harms Chinese interests. And so the very idea that the United States has had of let's negotiate deals that in some ways coalesce an alliance against China, deal with the manufacturing choke points, the supply chain dependencies that the whole world has, not just the United States. China is going to be very sensitive to that, of course, and they are not going to sit back and allow their economy to be isolated. So we're moving quickly, more quickly than before, into direct economic and commercial confrontation with China. And that just ups the, not just the stakes in the negotiations, but certainly adds tension between the US and China.
All right, last question, Juan, before I let you go. You've been incredibly generous with your time. If you're back in the Oval right now and you are at the ear of the president, you are advising him on economic national security, what would you tell him to do right now?
Jonathan, I think there are three things. And the good news is this administration has talked about economic security being national security. So they are fundamentally crystallizing things that we've been working on at the center for over a decade, as you know, with Mark Dubowitz and thanks to his leadership, and Cliff May, and now Elaine Dzinski leading the center. This idea that economic security is national security, and this is a domain of conflict and competition. So I would say three things. One, this is a moment to isolate China, or at least to work on alliances that isolate China and move toward decoupling and de-risking with respect to China on key strategic supplies, goods, and minerals, for example, rare earth minerals, et cetera. This is going to take time, so we have to think about a long-term strategy, but this is the moment to begin to galvanize the strategy for what that decoupling looks like. So let's do that. Two, we're going to need alliances in a way that it doesn't behoove us to alienate Europe at every corner, right? It doesn't behoove us to alienate our Asian partners. We're going to need the alliance of liberal economies and capital to actually confront China. So let's think about what those alliances look like. And even if we have to go toe-to-toe in negotiations, let's have a common end state in mind so we're not alienating every country in the world at this moment. The third thing I would say is we need to think about investment in capital as a part of national security. And that means thinking about how we bring investment into the US to reshore, to create the manufacturing that we want here in the US, whether it's semiconductors or other high-tech capabilities like quantum, but also how do we invest in key things like ports and infrastructure around the world that are important to the US military and US commercial interests? How do we do that with the private sector? We need to think about that. And I think this is an administration that's very open to working with the private sector in thinking about strategically US economic interests. So those are the things I would say. And there's a way of doing this in the US government that brings Commerce, Treasury, the White House, the Development Finance Corps, all of the elements of the government that have not really been brought together the way we did, Jonathan, you and I, post 9/11. That needs to be done now in the context of economic security. So those are the things I would recommend to the Oval.
Solid recommendations. All right, we're going to leave it there. Juan Zarate, thank you for joining us today on the FDD Morning Brief.
Thank you, Jonathan. I appreciate it.
Man, that guy's sharp on economic national security. Here's what FDD has on tap for you today. Check out the latest episode of FDD's Foreign Policy titled, Where in the World is Admiral Mark Montgomery? Host Cliff May, FDD's founder and president, sits down with our colleague Mark Montgomery, senior director of FDD Center on Cyber and Technology Innovation, CCTI. He's also a U.S. Navy veteran. Mark is one of those fascinating guys with stories from every corner of the globe. So many, in fact, it's hard to keep up. Taiwan, Ukraine, Israel, you name it. I highly recommend a listen. My colleagues Sinan Jidi, Brad Bowman, and Cameron McMillan have a new piece in Real Clear Defense, arguing that it's time for Washington to rethink its approach to Ankara and to start demanding more from a NATO ally that acts more like a NATO enemy. They contend that the United States should not make any further assistance to Turkey unless it is conditioned on the full removal of Russian S-400 missile systems that Turkey bought back in 2019. They need to see a total halt in support for Hamas and other terrorist groups and a complete cessation of aggressive actions toward Israel, Cyprus, and Greece. That's a long rap sheet there for Turkey, and I wonder if Ankara is listening. Finally, in addition to today's FDD event with Juan Zarate and company at 12 p.m. Eastern, we've got another event tomorrow, also at 12 p.m. Eastern, spotlighting the launch of our new program on air and missile defense, co-chaired by my colleagues Brad Bowman and Mark Montgomery. This cutting-edge initiative will focus on the capabilities needed to defend the United States and our allies and partners against hostile missiles, aircraft, and drones. This is important work, folks, and I highly encourage you all to tune in. With that, we're going to end it. It's enough hot air for me for one day. If you want to get brainier, check out the expert analysis on our website, FDD.org. Scroll through our quick takes on X at FDD, or find some fascinating video content on our Instagram and YouTube channels. And yes, you can always make a tax-deductible donation at fdd.org/invest. I'm glad you asked. We couldn't appreciate our donors more for making our work possible. Tune in Wednesday for another episode of the FDD Morning Brief. Until then, I am Jonathan Schanzer, signing off for FDD.